Cloud. Good afternoon. Thank you all for joining us for this final Northeast Cover Crop Council webinar. I'm Victoria Ackroyd, Program Manager for the Cover Crop Council, and my co-host is Susan Brulette, who is with the University of Vermont Extension. Today's session qualifies for 0.5 crop management CCA CEUs. We will put the slide up with the needed information at the end of this talk. The talk will be about 20 minutes long with 10 minutes at the end for questions. Please feel free to throw any questions in the chat as they come up, or you're certainly welcome to speak up at the end. This webinar is being recorded and will be available along with the slides on the University of Vermont Extension website. Captioner Emily is with us today, and if you need her services, please look to the comment in the chat. Today's speaker is Dr. John Wallace. He is a Penn State Associate Professor of Weed Science and an NECCC board member. His research applies weed science, plant ecology, and agroecology principles to current weed management problems. His lab conducts weed control trials, manipulated field experiments, on-farm trials, and multidisciplinary cropping systems experiments. John, thank you for speaking today. The screen is yours.
Okay, thanks, Victoria. Let's see, did I do that right? Great. Okay, well, good morning, or I guess good afternoon, folks. I'll go ahead and jump right in. As the last webinar series, I'm going to today talk about really some cover crop termination best management practices. I'm going to start with a quote from John Teasdale, who over 30 years ago in one of his many important research summaries wrote that the role of winter annual cover crops for sustainable weed management is to replace an unmanageable weed population with a more manageable cover crop. And I really love, as a weed scientist, love that passage for many reasons, but I thought it was a good place to start today because a more manageable cover crop is one that we can terminate effectively when you want to terminate it based on your cover crop management goals. And in some cases, particularly as we manage cover crops more intensively, it requires a higher level of management to terminate those cover crops effectively. And so this picture, I think, does a nice job of illustrating that point. It comes from a cover crop trial on a long-term no-till grain farm in Lancaster County in Pennsylvania. And to the line, you can see the weed suppression benefits of a cover crop in early spring and the level of suppression of winter annual weeds that we can get from a well-established cover crop. And from this picture, we might assume that we've achieved that goal and that pre-plant burn down management should be simplified by having this cover crop that is manageable. But what you don't see in this picture is that it's a 3-species mix that contains brassicas, legumes, and rye. And this is kind of in the early spring in that green up period. And this cover crop is really about to take off and put on a lot of biomass production. And so as cover crop termination is delayed in this scenario, it's going to take a higher level of management to kill it successfully. And so when I think about termination and whether you have a more manageable cover crop, it's going to depend on things like the weather conditions, which can affect how successful you are at termination, the cover crop species you're dealing with, whether you're working with monocultures or mixtures, the growth stages or kind of phenological development of those cover crops, as well as considerations for how you want to manage the cash crop that follows it. And so the goal today is to really share a range of best management practices for cover crop termination so that you can be successful terminating your cover crop based on your management goals. And the way I'm going to do that is I'm going to share highlights or kind of take-home points from a new fact sheet series that myself and colleagues in the Mid-Atlantic have recently produced and can now be found on the GROWS website. And I'll end the talk today by sharing a link and a QR code that will take you to that website if you want to go ahead and download these fact sheets. But this series of fact sheets are really focused on herbicide-based termination methods for no-till production systems. Okay, so just walking through kind of what we think are important points to consider. Our first fact sheet focuses on what we see as herbicide application best management practices. And so that really starts with selecting kind of a herbicide base program that you're going to use, and then understanding kind of application factors that are important in order to optimize control levels with those products. And so we typically recommend either glyphosate or paraquat as kind of the base product for chemically terminating cover crops in the spring. And that's because these two products are broad spectrum herbicides. They don't have any residual activity, and therefore they don't have any application restrictions prior to cash crop planting. So you have a good bit of flexibility in how you use these products in a burn down scenario. But what is important is that these two products differ in a few significant ways. And so glyphosate is a systemic herbicide, whereas paraquat is a contact herbicide. And so because of this, they require different types of kind of application strategies to be successful. So the important things to consider when you're selecting one of these herbicides is your nozzle selection, the appropriate carrier volume, and then what you're putting in the tank with these herbicides, whether it's adjuvants, water conditioners, or other herbicide products. And so because glyphosate is a systemic herbicide, there's more flexibility in the range of nozzles and therefore kind of droplet patterns that you can use and be successful, as well as carrier volumes. So because it's systemic, we can use coarser droplet sizes and lower carrier volumes and still be successful with glyphosate-based burn down programs. But because paraquat is a contact herbicide, coverage is key. Spray coverage is key. And so using nozzles that have fine to medium droplets and increasing your carrier volume, particularly as you start using paraquat in denser stands, is really critical for ensuring good spray coverage and good control levels. And so there's also some differences between these products when it comes to what you're putting into the tank. And I just want to illustrate one of those considerations, and that is the potential for other products antagonizing the efficacy of either glyphosate or paraquat, which can result in slower or reduced levels of cover crop control. And so the pictures that you are seeing are from some recent field trials conducted here at Penn State, focusing on termination strategies for cover crops. These pictures were taken 7 days after terminating cereal rye with various treatments. And we were targeting in this picture about the cereal rye boot stage. The top panel is glyphosate applied at 2 different rates. The rate on the left is a reduced rate. The rate in the middle, 3/4 of a pound, is perhaps a more typical rate, but maybe also on the lower end. And then paraquat applied alone at a standard rate. And I want you to take a look at that top row compared to the bottom row, because the only difference between the top and the bottom row is that the bottom row includes those same products at those same rates, but with the addition of atrazine in the tank. And so what is clearly evident from these pictures is that atrazine, and it's also the case that other triazine herbicides like metribuzin can antagonize the efficacy or slow the efficacy of glyphosate. But in contrast, those types of products can actually enhance the activity of paraquat. So there are important differences when it comes to tank mixes between these types of products. Now, as the case in this trial in the bottom panel, and in almost all cases, even when we see this level of antagonism, the cover crops typically end up dying in these kind of glyphosate-based programs. But it can be slowed significantly, and in a cool spring, as I'll discuss in the next slide, it can be even slower. And that can matter depending on when you're planting that cash crop, whether it's corn or soybeans. And so if you have cover crops that are still struggling along and are not completely killed, you can suffer from some competition or kind of indirect impacts on early season crop growth. So it's something to watch out for. Okay, and so the next really important factor is waiting for the right weather conditions to make sure that you're being you can be successful with these various types of burn down products. And so the reason why is that herbicide absorption into the leaves of cover crops or your target species, as well as the movement of that herbicide to the target site of action, whether that's in the leaves or whether it needs to be translocated through the plant, is necessary for that herbicide to be effective, and weather influences those processes. And in general, when we're killing cover crops early in the spring under cooler conditions, those processes are slowed, right? And so if your management goal is to kill cover crops early in the spring, perhaps prior to them taking off and producing a lot of biomass or several weeks ahead of cash crop planting, it's important to wait for that maybe kind of unseasonably warm week in the spring that we often get, where cover crops have greened back up and you have a 3 to 4 day stretch of really nice growing conditions. And so the targets that we suggest looking for is a 3-day stretch of daytime temps that get into the mid 50s and nighttime temps that are at least above freezing, if not closer to 40 degrees. And so if you can find that stretch of weather in the spring, that means that those cover crops are probably actively growing, and therefore absorption, translocation are going to improve under those conditions. Beyond kind of temperature, soil moisture and humidity and dew are all factors that are important to consider because they influence the absorption and uptake of those herbicides into cover crops. And so humidity typically improves absorption. Some soil moisture is necessary for keep those cover crops actively growing, and oftentimes improves uptake relative to really dry spells. So wait for the right weather to make sure that you can be effective. That's important regardless of the product. It's really particularly important for glyphosate because of that systemic activity. Okay, so our next kind of fact sheet that we produced was focused on selecting the herbicide program, or kind of expanding your herbicide program based on weed pressure in the spring, but also your cover crop selection, whether you're using monocultures or mixtures. And so a well-managed cover crop stand suppresses many winter annual weeds. It's really can be significant when you get a good catch. But it's still necessary to scout for weeds in your cover crop stands to understand whether you need to adjust your herbicide program, thinking beyond of just killing that cover crop, but to also target weeds that are within those cover crop stands. And so when you think about doing that, I suggest placing weeds into 2 categories in the spring. So you may have some species like on the left side or the left picture, things like dead nettle or many winter annual mustard species that flower sometime in spring, and depending on when you're terminating that cover crop, may have already flowered or be close to completing their life cycle. And so adding additional products to target those species may or may not really provide a return on investment if they're that advanced in their life cycle. One consideration would be those types of weed species could be real competitive if you're growing winter annual grains, winter wheat or other winter cereals in your rotation. And so you might do a better job targeting those weed species if that's the case. But then there's other species that might be present in those stands, other winter annuals, in particular horseweed or mare's tail, that complete their life cycle typically after cover crop termination occurs. And that's particularly the case if you're delaying cover crop termination. You may also have some early emerging summer annual species in that stand as well. And so those two scenarios, things like horseweed that continues to grow into the early part of the summer, or those early emerging summer annuals, it's important to consider what you need to have in the tank beyond the product that you've identified to control the cover crop in order to target those weed species. And so just an example of that, mare's tail, because it's glyphosate resistant, is a particular problem in that type of scenario. And even though winter cereals like cereal rye do a nice job of suppressing mare's tail, if the stand hasn't established that well, you may have a scenario like the picture on the right where you have a mare's tail population that is doing quite well in the understory of cereal rye. And as you delay termination later into the spring, it becomes harder to get good coverage and good control of those weeds that are below that cover crop profile. And so in that scenario, we've done some field trials here at Penn State that have looked at selectively targeting broadleaf weeds like mare's tail within a winter cereal stand. So we're allowing that winter cereal to continue to grow as a cover crop, but we're controlling those problematic weed species like mare's tail earlier in the spring. And so we found a range of products that can do that job, 2,4-D and dicamba being probably the go-to products in that case. Okay, and so the next consideration then when you think about kind of expanding your herbicide program is whether you're growing a monoculture, and in particular, a cereal rye or a winter cereal monoculture, or a cover crop mixture that might contain some combination of grasses, legumes, and winter hardy brassica species. And so the real kind of the take home here is pretty simple. In almost all cases, when you're including a legume or a brassica in your cover crop mixture, you're typically going to need more than just glyphosate to be effective in burn down scenarios when you're trying to kill that cover crop mixture stand. As a base product, glyphosate and paraquat do provide broad spectrum activity on grasses and broadleaf species, but activity doesn't necessarily equate to full control levels that you need to get that cover crop killed. So in the Mid-Atlantic, we recommend tank mixing a systemic broadleaf product like 2,4-D or dicamba to improve control of legume and brassicas in cover crop mixtures. And tank mixing these synthetic auxins typically also improve control of broadleaf weed species that might be in that cover crop stand as well. So the choice of product or synthetic auxin in this case, as well as the product rates, will depend on the cover crops and the weed species, but also the pre-plant restrictions that you'll find on herbicide labels. And I'm just going to highlight one scenario that you can find within these fact sheets. So if we take the example of 2,4-D and dicamba, when we use these products before soybean, the primary consideration will be pre-plant restrictions that are rate dependent, as well as dependent on the soybean trait, whether you're using dicamba tolerant soybeans Extend or 2,4-D tolerant soybeans Enlist. But cover crop mixtures are more often positioned before corn, and in corn there's more flexibility when it comes to product rates. The label recommendations talk about pre-plant restrictions relative to corn planting in order to limit the potential for corn seedling injury. And that may be important as we move to the next subject and the next focus area within our fact sheet series. And that is how to think about both positioning your herbicide program and kind of sequencing your herbicide program when you're delaying cover crop termination to at or after cash crop planting. So we typically refer to that as planting green. And particularly, how do we think about doing this when we're also roll crimping cover crops? And so over the years, we've gotten a lot of questions about whether it's better to spray first, then roll crimp, or roll crimp, then spray, or if spraying's even necessary. And so we recommend that in conventional systems that you think about using herbicides as the primary means for killing the cover crop, and using roll crimping as a means for managing that surface residue to really improve crop establishment and reduce interference for those cash crops. And there's a couple reasons for that. One is that to be effective from a termination standpoint with a roll crimper, we have very narrow agronomic windows for winter cereals like cereal rye or triticale. We have to wait till they're in advanced growth stages at that anthesis stage to be effective. That's not also always going to align with your desired cash crop planting dates. And even if we do hit that date, we don't achieve total control, which can create some volunteer weed issues if we don't get good control with roll crimping. And so what we've found in field trials is that when we still want to use roll crimping as a residue management tool, and we're targeting kind of later growth stages of winter cereals like cereal rye, glyphosate-based programs will be effective whether you're applying that product before or after roll crimping. And glyphosate's generally going to be more effective than paraquat in those scenarios. But for paraquat-based programs, tank mixing with atrazine or another synergist to enhance activity and applying paraquat after roll crimping provided the highest levels of control. So a good bit of flexibility if you're using glyphosate-based programs as far as how you sequence herbicide applications and roll crimping in your system. Okay, I have one more kind of fact sheet that we put together. I just want to share the highlights of, and that is thinking about tougher to control cover crops and maybe the need to adjust your control strategy appropriately. And so when we think about tough to control cover crops, really all cover crops can potentially become weeds, but some pose greater risks than others. And so the things that you're looking for are weedy traits that the cover crop has. Hard seed is one that is often talked about. Short life cycles that might result in early seed shatter if conditions prevent you from terminating that cover crop when you need to. There's also some species that are just harder to control with herbicides due to different physiological processes in those plants, whether it's reduced uptake or translocation or some inherent tolerance to herbicide sites of action that we use. So in the Northeast, the one that we talk about the most and that is the most problematic from a termination standpoint is annual ryegrass, which has a lot of great properties as a cover crop, but due to a number of factors is just harder to control in no-till systems with herbicide-based termination strategies. And so based on research that we've done, we have three kind of suggestions when it comes to controlling annual ryegrass. One, you definitely want to use glyphosate-based programs. Higher rates improve control. We almost always see a rate response. It's also important to target those sprays in warmer weather. And so a lot of control recommendations talk about targeting the warm weather, but also small plants. And that might not align in any given spring. And our research demonstrates that it's more important to wait for warmer weather, even if that means applying or terminating that ryegrass at later growth stages or after it's produced more biomass. And then finally, we've also found that if you really want to reduce the risk of weed control failures or reduced efficacy with ryegrass, to make sure that you're limiting the risk of that becoming a volunteer weed, there are some tank mix options. So using glyphosate in combination with a group 1 herbicide like clethodim or a group 2 herbicide that has grass activity like rimsulfuron has proven to be really consistent in our field trials. Okay, so looks like I'm only leaving a few minutes for questions, but I'm gonna skip over this summary slide and just advertise where you can find all this information and end there. So again, you can use this QR code that will take you right to the GROW website where you can download these fact sheets. Also, very happy to follow up with anybody if they have any questions, and we can do that now, Victoria. So thank you.
Awesome. Thanks so much, John. We'll give it a beat, and then actually Susan's going to put up the QR code for the folks that need the CCA CEUs. But with that said, we are at the end of the presentation, and we do have a couple minutes for questions. Does anyone want to put something in the chat or speak up? I will say, John, I didn't realize that herbicides can interact with each other to decrease their own efficacies. That's a new piece of information for me. It's always wonderful what you can learn, keep learning.
Yeah, that's I think that oftentimes when we get a call from a producer that has kind of a control failure when it comes to cover crop termination, it's not one factor, it's a combination of multiple factors. Oftentimes it's the cool weather in the spring in combination with some of those issues that can occur in the tank. So maybe some of those antagonism issues when they're trying to burn those cover crop down, but also apply their residual program ahead of that cash crop.
This is Ken. I'll just quick comment, I guess, and question. Great information. Just with the legumes, with the mixes, we seem to do pretty well with just straight glyphosate program with Crimson, but Vetch is the one that seems to take it up a notch, and you have to do something else.
Yeah,
I don't know about the 9, 8, 7 where that is, but I saw Crimson, well, I guess was an 8, but it seems like glyphosate does okay, But anyway.
Yeah, there are some differences, Ken, that we have found between the legumes. And we have found that glyphosate is more effective on crimson relative to medium red clover, but also hairy vetch as well. So I think the combination of adding the synthetic auxin in there is probably going to provide some better consistency. But that's not to say that you can't be effective with glyphosate only programs for under certain scenarios.
Right. Yeah. For us so far, we haven't had a bad experience with the Crimson with just glyphosate.
Yeah.
Where we'd say, oh man, that just didn't work. But that definitely has definitely the case with with the vetch and then of course the brassicas are a whole nother kettle of fish. So,
Sure. Yeah.
But yeah, hey, thanks a lot.
You're welcome.
Thanks. So with that said, we are now past 12:30. Stay on if you need that QR code. Otherwise, it's been great seeing everybody. The recordings and PDFs are up on the University of Vermont Extension website. This is the final webinar of this series. So Susan, thank you so much for co-hosting with me. John, thank you for speaking today. I hope everybody has a great rest of their week. I'm going to go on